Hello, everybody. We are here at World of Paleoanthropology. Today, we are here with Stephanie Baker, and we're going to let her introduce herself and tell us a little bit about what she does and who she is.
Thank you. Thanks, Seth, for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm Stephanie Edwards Baker. I work at the Paleo Research Institute at the University of Johannesburg, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Drimolen Research Hominin Project, which is, as we I think know, in the last couple years, produced some really exciting stuff. So I hope we can touch on that today.
Oh, definitely. We will very much be talking about the recent finds, especially. Now, so how did you find yourself in the position that you're in?
That's an interesting story. So I started with the Drimolen project when I was a master's level student. It was my first year back in 2011. And I actually came on when the previous permit holder, Colin Mentor, needed a student assistant for one of his field schools that he was running. And at the time, it was, I think, the first one that he'd launched with a Canadian university, the University of Victoria. And so he invited me along because we'd crossed paths through recent research that we'd been doing at Town, which was great fun. And so I came across and started helping out with the field schools. And before I knew it, Colin had offered me a PhD position. And I started my PhD with him. And in around about 2014, I came onto the permit with him because he was based in Canada. So I acted as the South African kind of liaison for the permit and helped run things on the day-to-day. And then in 2011, he left or rather 2017, sorry. He left the permit and I stayed behind, and I took over and I invited my very good friend and colleague, Andy Harries, to assist me. And the two of us have been running it ever since, and it's been great fun.
That is amazing. And I know for years now, we've been hearing things coming out of this site, and let's talk backwards in time, starting with the most recent. So just in 2020, what was your big announcement that everyone should know about?
So there were two, which was great.
Two. Okay.
Yeah, there was the two. So technically one is one of those really awkward papers that falls on the cusp of December, January. So we're not quite sure, is it 2020, 2021? It's really frustrating for referencing. But so one we have decided is 2021 to space ourselves out. So that most recent one was the announcement of a brand new skull and cranium that we'd found of Paranthropus robustus. The specimen number is DNH 155, and he is beautifully preserved. And we're so fortunate to have discovered him when we did, because he highlights that the Drimolen sample looks like the Drimolen sample and not like other large repositories of Paranthropus robustus in Southern Africa. So we could start making some inferences about microevolutionary changes in a species in very short periods of time. So that was the most recent.
And to those of us who are a little less involved, what does this mean exactly for what we know about human evolution?
Great. Yeah, this is a fantastic little find, because basically at its essence, what it highlights is how important it is to have very good dates at these fossil sites. And historically, karstic systems, there's always been this kind of idea that they're really tricky to date. But as techniques have been developed and furthered, and we understand karstic stratigraphy and how these caves form and what we can date, what we can't date, we've started to get really great resolution on the dates themselves. So for Drimolen main quarry, which is where all of the hominins are, it's really useful, and we are extremely spoiled in the fact that that particular infill is very simple, geologically speaking. And so we were able to get really, really good dates for the sample. So our dates now for main quarry and all the hominins in it are 2.04 to 1.95 million. which is really significant because not only is it a tiny little age bracket of info, which means that everything that comes in there was living on the land surface at a very short period of time. So you're not looking at kind of change over time in these long average type assemblages where you're picking up the earliest and the latest. So we're just picking up this kind of very short period. So that's one thing that's quite useful. And the next thing is that because we have so much Paranthropus robustus at the site, it has really become one of the major players in understanding paleo biology for paranthropines, and specifically in Southern Africa. And then this site date was a lot older than all previous estimates, because up until that point, we'd had mostly faunal dates, and that suggested something in the neighborhood of 1.4 to 1.5, something more akin to, say, Cooper's D in age. But actually, we're looking at something much older, which is quite interesting, because before DNH 155, the most complete Paranthropus robustus skull ever discovered was DNH 7, also from Drimolen, but the little female of the species. And she was discovered in 1994 by Andre Kaiser. And what was fascinating about her is she was so gracile relative to all the other Paranthropus skulls that we had as examples. So Kromdry, the TM1517 over there, and then we've got some of the Swartkrans material. And when you compared them, she looks different overall. She's still clearly a paranthropine in that she has that flattened face, she has the wider dentition, her maxillary or the cheekbones are very flared and dramatic, like you see in all the other robusts. But she's very little and she lacks the sagittal crest. Her orbit shape is somewhat different. And then also the position of that kind of maxillary flare or the cheek flare is on a different spot on the face relative to all the other crania. And what previous researchers had done in light of that, it has suggested that she was female and all the others were male. But now with the discovery of 155, he shares these same characteristics with her that they then don't share with the rest of them. And what we've been able to do, match that with the age, is say, well, Drimolen accumulated over a really important little snapshot time period where the environment is shifting towards this more grassland-like landscape. It's getting slightly cooler. And so we suggest that it's most likely that if we look at the 2 million, for example, estimated Drimolen sample, they represent the earliest version. And then a very, very, very short change later, the Swartkrans hanging remnant material comes in and they look different. And all the differences are related to diet and chewing mechanisms. So we're saying that this is very short-term reaction in a species lineage to landscape change to develop a diet that can accommodate it.
Fascinating.
Super cool, right?
It is. It truly is. And it definitely plays a major role in, you know, advancing our understanding of what's going on. And as far as where was the paper published?
So that paper was published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I remember when that came out, and it was pretty big. It was, you know, right, the new year had just started, and it was like right from the get-go, it was going to be a good year for fossils because that came out of the ground. Well, it didn't come out of the ground that year, but you released the paper that year.
Exactly.
So does this raise more questions or does it answer more questions?
Well, I think as always is the case with Paleoanth, it always raises questions. I sincerely doubt there's ever been a find that just goes, oh, okay, well, that solves that then. And we can move on with our lives. No, it definitely does raise some interesting questions, specifically when you look at things like the species concept. Because I think paleoanthropology is now, especially in the caustic systems at least, moving towards this kind of slight stage where we're getting really good dates. Like Malapa is a great example of, very precise date. And now again, Drimolen, and there's some other dates that are coming up in the works now. And so now with us getting this kind of resolution, instead of what has ordinarily been the case is these large kind of grand sweeping discussions around taxons, we can start saying very specific things at temporal kind of niches, which is really important because it does give us some insight into at least small scale behavioral changes in an extinct species, which is an extraordinary thing to have the availability to do. Because up until the point, you're always going, oh, well, Paranthropus, it's kind of 1.8 to 1 million. Well, I mean, presumably it changed over 1.8 to, and now we know actually it's 2 million to 1 million, which is an extraordinary long-lived and very successful species. And so what does that look like? What does that mean? And how are they sharing and navigating the landscape alongside Homo? Because early Homo is on the landscape at the same time. And right at the beginning there, we also have Australopithecus running around. So you have three of these guys all sharing the landscape. How are they niching this out? And so it's starting to become really exciting because now it's no longer just about, oh, well, this was the species, this is where it lived, this is when it lived, and this is how it fed. Now we can start going, well, this is how it fed, and this is how it likely interacted with others, and this is how they had to niche out. And so what strategies were they developing, which is all insight into kind of cognitive capabilities of these very ancient ancestors. So it's really exciting, at least for me.
I was going to ask if you thought people 100 years ago, and then I thought that was too far in the past, and then I thought 50, and then I'm thinking even 10. Do you think people 10 years ago would have thought we'd be able to find out so much information from a hominid fossil?
Oh, okay, 50 and 100, definitely not. If you look back at the history, I mean, Child wasn't even discovered 100 years ago, which is kind of extraordinary to think of. And so, it's 10 years ago, probably again, not. Although I imagine 10 years ago, we had huge advances in technological leaps. And I think any researcher or any scientist would have been silly to have said no. Because things have, in the last couple of decades, just progressed at such an extraordinary rate. And it really does kind of make you boggle at what the next 10 years will see. I mean, we've just seen the latest announcement of some of the oldest DNA in the world from the mammoth. And that was an extraordinary.
Right, I saw that.
So old. So, hey, fingers crossed, we might be able to start applying some of those techniques down here in the South, or figuring out how to extract from these caustic cave systems. So who knows? Yeah, I doubt that they would have seen it to this level, but I'd be surprised if they said no. I sincerely hope they didn't.
The funny part is I should have prefaced that question with, I thought 10 years ago was 2000.
I know, isn't that horrid? Same thing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
No,
So,
I mean, 2020, if you look back 10 years, that's 2010, and that was Sediba was coming out. It was extraordinary, and it was one of the first species found in Southern Africa for ages. And so, I think that really kick-started the next massive wave of interest in Southern African paleo.
Definitely. And so where do you think this wave that South Africa has been riding on fossil-wise is going, especially at your site?
Across the board in Southern Africa, I hope that this wave does two things. I hope the first thing that it does is really inspire and just really move people towards this interest in Southern African paleo. Not that it's been lacking, but I think it's lacking in the local kind of groups, because South Africa has this very deep history of a disconnect between the local people and then the scientists who just more often than not are foreigners. And so I'm hoping that this really kicks off in this new generation of young South Africans, this massive interest in, what's happening in their backyard, and hopefully move a lot more South Africans into the field itself. That would be phenomenal. I also hope that, it encourages some of the other sites to start doing these techniques and these dates, because the better the dates, just the better our understanding all in all. I know I harp on it, and dates don't dictate interpretations, but they definitely do help. And
yeah.
The availability is there to get really high resolution dates on a lot of these sites. It just makes us able to take the data that we already have accumulated for these sites and put it into context, and temporal context especially, and we can start making a cross-site comparison. So that's really where Drimolen wants to go now, is start working on larger collaborative projects with other sites. So it's not just kind of inter-site focus, that we're rather looking at species-based focus and across different sites, and working in collaborative ways with other Paranthropus and early Homo sites to get a better understanding of the species rather than just our little hole in the ground.
Perfect. That's wonderful. And now, speaking of, your little hole in the ground, have there been, if you're allowed to speak of such things, have there been any associated bones found with the cranium?
Oh, postcranial bones?
Yes. No. None.
No, I can tell you conclusively, we dug. But no, not that particular one.
Okay. That that would have been something. I'm sure the team was very looking for things.
Yeah. So because of the way it was in the ground, when we uncovered it, it was fairly clear that we were just dealing with a cranium, because he was entirely inverted. So the teeth were sticking up. And so the rest of him would have been higher up and or slumped. And we did expand out, but no, we've not recovered anything else with DNH 155.
So just narrate for us, because finding something like this does not happen often. I mean, we hear of things, that Lee Berger's doing, and he seems to be, have some fossil finding magic about him. But
Yeah.
A find like this is still extraordinarily rare and unique. So can you illustrate for us what it was like when the fossil was actually, taken from the ground?
It was a scary day. So it was actually, as is almost always the case with Drimolen, and at least in recent years, all of our significant finds are discovered by students, which I think is fantastic. Because I don't think there's a better way to ensure a student is obsessed with the field moving forward than for them to have, on their first ever dig, to uncover some miraculous, beautiful, preserved fossil hominin. So all of our fossils, including 152 and 134, both of which were published in the science paper last year. So all of those were discovered by students, which is a really extraordinary thing. So this particular one, 155, was discovered on Father's Day, which was lovely, by a young student called Samantha Good. So Sam, what's really cool about Sam is she is actually South African, but moved when she was fairly young to Canada with her folks, and then came back to South Africa because her dad was really fascinated about the field, and he sparked this interest for her. And so she came to the field school that we run in collaboration with La Trobe University in Melbourne, which is where Andy is based, and then with Dave Straight at Washington University in St. Louis in the US. And so she comes through, and she's in this horrible hovel of a little area in the site, poor thing. And it's called the freezer, and it's called that for a very good reason, because it just gets no daylight sun at all. It's just in this really awkward position between breccia, and yeah, it was cold. And she was hanging out, and she was quite happy just being up there by herself, and she was digging, and all of a sudden we just get this call. And I think, if memory serves, she called Angie. So Angeline Lees, who is a long-term collaborator on the project, who's just got a PhD as well. So Dr. Angeline Lees, which is quite exciting. She gets called because it's teeth, and that's Angie's thing. So she calls and she's like, Angie, I think I found something. And so, Angie clambers up first, and then behind her she's like, Sediba! So then I clamber. And before you know it, there's tons of us in this tiny little hovel. And at the time, just the tooth row had been excavated out, and Sam had done an extraordinary job at doing just that. And she basically just went, I'm not touching it again. After lots of coercion. But what was a bit nerve-wracking is that we were already midway through our 3-week excavation. So we didn't have a lot of time, and we weren't entirely sure how extensive this was. So we started excavating, Ange and I, as quickly as we could. And she took one side of the skull and I took the other, and we started digging away. And before we knew it, it was like, no, there's more, and it keeps going and it keeps going, it keeps going. And we essentially just, this whole cranium started coming out. And so we would remove it in pieces because, unfortunately, these things are 2 million years old, so they tend to be quite fragmentary. But it was abundantly clear that the whole thing was in position, just slightly crushed. So there was lots of little fragmentary bits that we could kind of remove. And as we did it, we obviously took as much spatial data as we could, and we gave it to our, our puzzle maker, extremist savant, Jesse Martin, who takes all these tiny little fragments and somehow just knows exactly where they go. And so he sat down at base camp, and we were just feeding him little boxes of fragments, and he was just constantly rebuilding it from kind of the tooth row and the maxilla up as we dug it out. But then one day it got to the point where it was like, well, we can't take this out in smaller pieces anymore. This has to come out as a whole now. And that was a fun day. So everyone, you could just hear the entire site stopped. No one was breathing, not even the birds. Like, it was just pure silence as we just lift and into a bucket, and that was it. And we were just like, like, I need to go and have a lie down. But we got it all out, which was great. And then Jesse was able to beautifully reconstruct it. And it looks as extraordinary as it does today, which is amazing.
Do you have a percentile actually of how much of the skull you have?
Not off the top of my head. No, I don't think we do. Although if you look at some of the images, it's all there pretty much. And it is
Definitely.
Now the most complete of all the Paleoanthropus Robustus Crania in the world, which is very exciting. So he's trumped old DNH7, our beautiful little lady, and he's actually better preserved than she is. I think it also speaks to excavation technique, because when we first took over, Andy and I, we made a decision that previously Drimolen is kind of divided into 2 sections. There's a central excavation area, which is where the bulk of previous excavations have taken place, and that's a decalcified area. It's very easy to dig because it's just kind of soft sediment. But then there are other areas of the site that are up along the original in situ breccia exposures of the cave itself. And so we decided that it made a lot more sense to dig alongside those exposures, because the preservation there was likely going to be better, because the stuff that had just decalcified out would presumably be better preserved than that of anything in the central excavation, because it'd been lying there for much longer, right, and exposed. And so we did that, and that's exactly where things like 134, 152, and 155, which are 3 big kind of announcements in the last 2 years, all of those came along those exposed breccia deposits and not from the central area. So I think that's really been key, is shifting our understanding of, the site's geology and the stratigraphy, but then also managing our excavation technique accordingly, which has been quite useful.
Now, for a better understanding, can you describe the site just a little bit so we can get like an image in our head of what you're talking about?
Yeah, Drimolen is beautiful. It's so simple, which is what I had said earlier, but basically it's an old miner's pit, which is always almost often the case with the cradle. And so the miners have come in, and it's a single cavern that they blasted part of the roof off of, and another part kind of collapsed in. So now it's just, you've got the landscape and it comes up to the slight rise, and then you've got this wonderful little hollow in the ground, and that's Drimolen. And it's not overly big. Everyone fits in it quite comfortably, but there's the southern and eastern part of the site have lime miners disturbance. So those are paved and there's steps leading in, and it's very nice and well maintained. And then we have a nice big platform where we run most of the operations. We put a table out there, and that's where we do the sorting, and then also the theodolite. And then from that point, looking north, you look across the site. The entire site is banked by the original dolomite walls. So you can really see the full extent of what this cavern was. So it's a wonderful, simple little ball of a site where everything came in once and it closed, and that was it. And you've just had the miners' disruption since. Frustratingly, the miners did cause a bit of damage, obviously, because the flowstone that they were targeting actually undercut the entire deposit. And so when they blasted that, we have a bit of the breccia that was on the western face that slumped into what is now the central excavation area. So the site is almost stepped in that you have the dolomite walls, you have a breccia component on the western edge, and this kind of slow rise embankment leading in. And then you have another kind of whole divot, which is the central excavation area, which has really been where most of the excavation has taken place. And into kind of along that western wall is a lot of where the breccia still stands, and also where all of our dating samples come from, because all of that's in situ, which is nice. And then undercutting all of this is a modern cave system, which makes life a little tricky, because every now and again we're a little nervous that we might be digging into it, but we're not. We've thankfully double checked, and it actually undercuts along the western section, so it's very safe. But it does make you a bit nervous every now and again to know it's somewhat hollow underneath you. Really pretty site, and it's lined by trees all around, and we have a resident pair of mocking chats who shout at us all day.
So what other fauna is typically found at Drimolen, as well as obviously the rare hominid?
Yay. So this is my favorite part about it, because, the hominins are one very, very, very tiny aspect of a fossil assemblage, and everything else we find there is so critical. So Drimolen is fascinating. And again, it comes back to this 2 million, because we are picking up the turnover of kind of one group into the next group. So we have loads of carnivores, which is where my heart lives. So we have a lot of false saber-toothed cats, which is really exciting. So lots of Dinophilis. But we're the only site that picks up both Dinophilis barlowii, which is the earlier, and Dinophilis pivotoi, which you pick up at later sites like Swartkrans and Coopers. And so that's really exciting because we've got both. Then we have Meganterion, which is a saber-toothed cat with their nice big canines. Lots of leopard, like an extraordinary amount of leopard in the cave system. We have some lion, which is also quite unusual, especially for that very early period. And then we go across. We've got only 2 types of primates outside of the hominins, that is. So we have the larger Papio robinsoni, which is more like modern baboon-like. And then we have these leaf-eating monkeys, Cercopithecus williamsi, which are more along the lines of something like a macaque monkey, so a smaller little leader. We have elephant, which is very nice and very unusual. What's quite fascinating about it is we have at least 3 individuals, which is also quite strange because elephants don't tend to go into caves. So it's quite a fascinating kind of component. And they're not common in the cradle at all. So that's quite cool. We have giraffe. So there's a lot of indication of a lot of tree-dependent species. And Drimolen is quite interesting in that it's not along the major Paleo river that all of your other characteristic hominin sites like Stackfontein, Swartkrans, and Kromdraai are. So it's not along the Blauwbank. It's further north and more, say, inland off the 2 main river systems. And it's also very high in elevation. So there's a major question as to kind of like, well, why this high hominin component, which is what we're going to start exploring. But we definitely know that there's water in the immediate because we've picked up flay rat, so which are a marshy swamp dependent type species. So yeah, that's always my thing with understanding the fauna, is it really gives us a lot of insight into, the hominins themselves. And yeah, the species that we find there are quite fascinating. We're very lucky in that most are very beautifully preserved. We have some of the nicest specimens of baboon in the cradle, especially for the age bracket that we're dealing with. And lots of Dinophilis, which is also quite nice. Partial skeletons, which is rare.
Now, straying from hominins just for a second, I've heard of this in maybe 1 or 2 documentaries. What is a false saber-toothed cat?
So yes, so saber-toothed cats are a fascinating group, but you do have 2 kind of sections to it. So you have true saber-toothed cats, which are a lot like the North American Smilodon. So they are true saber-tooths in that their overall anatomy is quite specific. They're lacking things like the auditory bulle, or it's a big bony protrusion of the ear on the base of the skull, and theirs is actually cartilage. So all of us have a bony auditory bulle. There's this cartilage base because of the amount of opening in the jaw that they have to attain, because they have those huge saber-like teeth. So the main difference is the canines, of course. So in the true saber-tooths, you're looking at a saber-like canine, where it's extremely long. It extends past the mandible, and often the mandible extends a little bony protrusion at the base to create a sheath for the tooth to kind of slot into, to keep it safe when the mouth is closed. The tooth is extremely thin side to side, and it's got a bit of a ridge running down it, but that's really the key, is it's how thin it is medialaterally, so from like side to side this way, but it's quite wide front to back. In the false saber-tooths, it's a very similar premise in that they also have these really extended sabers, and their upper canines particularly, but they're not nearly as extensive as your trues. So they do extend past the jaw, but you don't get the bony protrusion on the lower jaw. And also they're much wider side to side, and they tend to be serrated on the back side of the canine, on the blade. They also have the bony auditory bulle. So it's a divergence in a group, but they're essentially tackling very similar things and going about it in different ways. The sabers tend to become hyper specialized in that particular type of behavior, and it's mostly down to hunting. And then the false saber-tooths tend to have a bit more leeway with how they can go about killing prey and stuff, because they're not as specialized and adept in the canine structure.
That is awesome. And, I love, learning things that I had no idea about beforehand. So that was wonderful. Now, going back to anthropology and the reason we're here tonight, or today in your case, what do you think is generally speaking, and I ask this of most of my guests, what is anthropology going to look like in the next 10 years, in your opinion?
From the perspective of science or from the perspective of scientists would be my question.
That is a good counter question. From the perspective of, let's say, actually a outsider, like they're getting their knowledge from the news, they get their info from sites like mine, things like that. What's it going to look like to those people?
I hope, and I do think that this is very much the trend, is that it will be far more accessible than it has been up until now. I think that anthropology and paleoanthropology in particular serves a very important place in modern society from a political perspective when one considers that, you know, human evolution is the history of all of us, and it's a joint common heritage. And so I think that accessibility to it is critical because, of course, as with anything, a more educated public is a more understanding, and they tend to be less biases and generalizations across the board. So for me, I hope that it is moving to the point where science communication really is becoming a forefront of what has always been a very niche and isolated science, quite ironically. And so, yes, I think it's really important that scientists make as much of an effort as possible to make what they are doing accessible and make the understanding of human evolution tangible to people who are not, you know, living it day to day and haven't had, you know, 2 degrees down their belts and so on. I also hope that it looks more representative of the places where it's happening. And I really, this is a bit of a political thing on my end, but I'm very, very passionate about the idea that, you know, this is taking place more often than not in, you know, African countries with Eastern African sites and then South Africa in particular. And there are so few locals represented in the actual scientific guild doing the work. And that is starting to change, but it really does need to move, and it needs to go a lot further than what it is. South Africa, for example, the representation of the people who are doing the sites is apartheid era type representation. There's so few local Black South Africans doing research in the cradle, for example. I am, as it stands, one of the only South African permit holders in the cradle, and I'm white, so that doesn't even help. I have a very good colleague, Noni Vilakazi, who's a great example of how this is beginning to change. She works with the Bolt's farm team, and she's on the permit there. And yeah, we need to just start making a more concerted effort to make sure that that kind of representation extends across the board, because not only is it important for the science itself, but it's also important when we do science communication that it's not a bunch of, you know, foreign white people sitting here telling local Black South Africans like you should care about your heritage. I mean, it's just, there's such a disconnect there, and yeah, I think it's critical, and that we start opening up the dialogue about how we discuss human evolution to different groups, because there is this trend that it's quite pompous, bunch of academics. We can't help ourselves, to be fair. And so we talk about all these things that are just common knowledge to us, and most people look at us and go, okay, what the heck was that word? And they can't even ask the question because they can't repronounce it. And so we need to make it tangible, and we need to aim it at, you know, people who are not academics. That at least is where I hope the field goes. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more discussion about species concepts, to go back to more of the academic side of things. I think it's going to be fascinating, because I think the new dates and understanding nuances of slight changes in species over time is going to start making us reconsider, well, are these two separate things, or are these the same thing but just divided out by 100,000 years? And does that mean that we are getting enough resolution to actually move towards things like subspeciating Pleistocene level hominin species, which is an extraordinary idea, to have enough resolution to go, well, actually, these are actually the same thing. They're just behaving differently because of the climate, or they've changed where they live, or whatever the case may be. And so I'm really excited to start seeing this really fine scale style research start happening on the huge samples that we've already amassed of a lot of this stuff.
I think you are very on point with where the field is going from the non-scientific perspective. And I think it's also very important that science becomes accessible to the common man. And, as you said, a more educated populace is a more peaceful populace. It's a more, etc. And as a student who is wanting to go into this field and to possibly even work in South Africa, I am very aware of the fact that, I could be taking the place of an African student who would be in that program, etc. And like...
Yeah, I don't want to discourage internationals. Sorry, not to, to clarify, I don't think it's about taking the place of. I think it's about joining. There is no reason why, if we look at South Africa today, that our student base in particular hasn't extended, so we can accommodate loads of students. So don't worry, and definitely come. You absolutely are not taking the spot of anyone. What we, I think, internally need to look at is we need to encourage the next generation, because in the States, this is already happening. And that's why we have as many, international based field schools, because we simply cannot fill those field schools with locals because they aren't interested. We don't have the student base here that we have internationally. And that's what we need to change. It needs to be a systemic change in our education-based program here in South Africa, where young local students are targeted, and we explain to them that this is a career option. This is something that you can be interested in, and grow it from there. So it's not an exclusion as such. It's simply that we just aren't getting these students through the door for a multitude of different political reasons. But one of them is the science communication. So yeah, so definitely come and pursue your degree. Absolutely. We'd love to have you in South Africa, and work alongside locals. It's not instead of.
And I think that's very important to make clear. And it's very, there are a lot of challenges and, like you said, systemic issues and reasons that South Africans are so hesitant to embrace even the idea of evolution. So education at a base level is something, but is that the role of paleoanthropologists, or is that the role of the government? Or both?
Both. Absolutely both. I think we as paleoscientists, as all academics, you have enough on your plate, and it's the race of trying to publish and stay alive and get funding and train students and all of these things. But we 100% have the ethical need, or the ethical challenge, that we must make a concerted effort to not just sit back and blame it on others. We are the practitioners of this field, so we are the best to speak of it. And so the government can't encourage young students to do something that they themselves don't understand. So the onus is on us to make sure it is understandable, it's tangible, and its importance is recognized, and then work alongside government bodies and other education institutes and outreach programs to make it accessible, because it doesn't help if we leave it to others and then sit back and criticize. And we also, it's so easy to sit back and criticize, oh, well, they got that wrong. Oh, they misinterpreted this. Oh, that, because they're trying to do it from an outsider's perspective without the background knowledge. So no, science communication, and particularly science communication practitioners who are themselves academics, is going to be, I think, key to the next rollout of this kind of accessibility plan.
Definitely, definitely. And, you know, it is, generally speaking, everyone's responsibility to teach the next generation how to responsibly move forward. But it is nice to see, just from when I started, which was right when Homo naledi was discovered in 2013, even just the change in, I'd say, what you'd call the climate of the science since then, the more openness and the more open access, the more willingness of scientists to start their own blog and have a blog. And for example, like John Hawkes has a wonderful blog, and do their own things instead of, and the fact that you guys have a Twitter account and you tweet what you're doing and you tweet photos of the fossils, it's just a level that has never been achieved before. And I think it's only going to bring bright things for the future.
I agree. It's the next evolutionary step, is this, including the technology. I mean, we have to, and it's just silly not to. You have it there, it's instantaneous, and you can reach millions of people. It's really the kind of the ideal, and Twitter's a great platform for that. It's also a naughty platform sometimes, when people can get away with just saying nonsensy things, but this is the devil that we deal with. But yeah, absolutely. And I love, I think most people who are coming into the field now, especially, are kind of the generation that have grown up with Facebook and Twitter and so on. And so it's just a natural progression that they're living their lives online, and that extends to the science as well.
Definitely. I know of a few anthropologists that probably do not and will not ever be on Facebook. So let's leave that there. But I think, what's really important is what we're doing here. And that's just communicating. And, I'm trying to bring to my audience something that you're doing that's amazing, and give you a space to talk about it. And I want you to talk about whatever you want, and give my audience this window into a world that they could never get anywhere else. And they love it.
Absolutely. People care about this. People are interested. And so, yeah, platforms like yours are fantastic, because, it's not just the small niche population, and the amount of people you've had on, and the amount of views your videos get is really indicative of the fact that this is a wanted type of media. People want accessibility. People want, it's much like, and this is going to sound so pompous, but it doesn't mean to be, but it's like celebrities on Twitter. It's the fact that there is a real life human being on the other side of this interacting, and it's no longer just this, oh my goodness, and they're over there real, and we don't know, and nobody's ever spoken to them, and we have no idea. But bringing this is bringing human beings back into the science, because all science is done by human beings. Regardless of whether it's a robot that carries out the procedure, there's a human being somewhere along the line. And we are complicated things, and we make mistakes, and we're political, and we're angry at each other, and no one wants to share, or now we do want to share. And so it adds this human-like dimension where people can then not only be interested in the science themselves, but also make an actual human connection with the people doing it, which makes it, again, it's this representation where, you know, say you had a colleague of mine on here, and next thing you know, it's like a little girl sitting there going, well, I'm a little Black girl and I could do this, you know, or I'm a little girl and I didn't think little girls could do paleo, you know, and so it's that kind of a thing where they can look at this and go, hey, I see a bit of me in there. And I mean, how can you talk about human evolution and paleoanthropology without people, you know? And so I think platforms like yours are fantastic for that, and getting faces to behind the science to come forward and share their stories.
Well, thank you very much. And, you know, with that, I think that is a perfect place for us to wrap up. So I shall smash the stop recording button.